Imagine discovering the two people you trusted most had betrayed you in the worst way possible. My wife, my brother, and one devastating secret that tore my life apart. This is the story of how I faced the unimaginable and fought to rebuild from the ruins. Looking back now, it's almost surreal to think about how drastically my life changed. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, everything felt straightforward and familiar. Life wasn't perfect, but I believed in the strength of my family. My younger brother, Ben, was always the one stirring up trouble, yet I thought we shared a bond that couldn't be broken. I never imagined that he would be the reason my entire world would collapse. I spent my days working as a mechanic, helping my dad run our family's garage. At home, I was married to my high school sweetheart, Lisa. For a while, life seemed steady, good, even. But that stability didn't last. Slowly, everything started to come apart. Ben, ever the rebellious one, had fallen deeper into addiction, particularly pills. My family, instead of holding him accountable, began to support him in ways that left me feeling betrayed. Against my better judgment, and despite my protests, they pushed me to let Ben move in with Lisa and me under the guise of helping him get back on his feet. What unfolded after that decision turned my life upside down. The betrayal that followed, from my brother and my wife, shattered everything I held dear, my trust, my family, and the very sense of home I cherished. It was a sunny day like any other. The yard was buzzing with laughter, and the smoky aroma of barbecue filled the air. Friends and coworkers had come over to celebrate my promotion to shop foreman. But for me, this wasn't just a celebration, it was a turning point. To be honest, it felt more like a farewell gathering, though no one else knew that yet. As the chatter carried on around me, I found myself needing a moment to breathe, to prepare. I stepped away from the lively crowd, my thoughts racing, knowing what was coming. The truth was, I wasn't just marking a new chapter in my career. I was preparing to walk away from the life I'd built. I turned to take in the scene behind me, a cheerful group of friends and family, all gathered in my honor. There were no kids running around, which was a relief, considering what I had in mind. I didn't plan to give just any speech, I wanted this to be unforgettable. With that resolve, I headed to my truck. Reaching into the cab, I retrieved what I'd brought as a visual aid for what I intended to say. Tucking it carefully into my waistband, I ensured it was hidden from view. I straightened up, took a deep breath, and walked back toward the gathering, determined to leave my mark on this day, and on the people who had brought me to this breaking point. I noticed my boss, Tommy Peterson, making his way toward me. Tommy was the kind of man who could light up a room just by walking into it. A towering presence, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd earned respect over decades. Despite being in his 50s, he had a smile so warm it could brighten half of Dallas. Walking beside him was his wife, Carol, a different story altogether. Carol wasn't exactly the root of my problems, but she sure had a knack for creating them. It was like she couldn't resist cracking the door open and letting trouble waltz right in. Whether she meant well or not didn't matter anymore, I was determined to put an end to it today. Carol Peterson was a bit on the heavy side but still carried herself well for her age. There was something about her demeanor, a mix of charm and nosiness, that made people gravitate toward her. She had this way of playing the role of the town's unofficial mother or grandmother, always ready with advice or unsolicited wisdom. The issue was, she believed too strongly in the saying, "Mama knows best." Ever since I'd moved to this town nearly a year ago, Carol had been on a relentless mission to play matchmaker. She made it her personal goal to find me the perfect woman. No matter how much I tried to politely decline her efforts, she simply wouldn't listen. I was still carrying the weight of my first marriage, and the last thing I wanted was someone meddling in my personal life. Maybe if I'd raised my voice or made a scene, she would have backed off. But that's just not who I am. I tend to keep things quiet and private, a trait I was beginning to regret. Well, today was different. Today, I was done being polite. I spotted Carol sitting with a group of the other wives, all of them grinning like they just solved the world's greatest mystery. They looked so pleased with themselves, and my stomach churned as I realized why. There she was, sitting right among them, the perfect match they'd chosen for me. She was stunning, no doubt about it. Barely 5 feet tall, with long blonde hair, a trim figure, and a face that always seemed perfectly made up, thanks to her job at a beauty salon. If I didn't know better, I might have thought they'd hit the jackpot. At one point in my life, I would have agreed. But that was before. The perfect woman they'd been parading in front of me for the last few months was none other than my ex-wife, Lisa. The sight of her sitting there, laughing along with them as if nothing had happened, made my blood boil. What stung even more was that Carol and the others knew who she was. They didn't know the full story of why our marriage had ended, it wasn't their business, but I'd made it clear we were divorced. Somehow, that information wasn't enough to deter them. And now here we were, with everyone pretending this was some grand romantic setup instead of the train wreck I knew it to be. I didn't want to date Lisa. I didn't want to talk to her. In fact, I didn't even want to be in the same state as her. And yet, there she was, my ex-wife, sitting pretty in the middle of a circle of women who looked absolutely delighted with themselves for bringing us face to face. It didn't take a genius to figure out what Lisa had told them about our divorce. She had a knack for skipping over the hard truths and spinning things in her favor. And she could charm the socks off just about anyone. It was one of the reasons I'd fallen for her in the first place, though now that same charm made my blood boil. Judging by the way Carol and her group were looking at her, I knew exactly what Lisa had done. She'd put on her best regretful ex-wife act, telling them all how she'd made some vague, terrible mistake and that I wouldn't even give her the time of day. I could practically hear her voice, laced with just the right amount of heartbreak. I still love him so much, and I pray every day that he'll forgive me. It was nauseating how well she played the part. But I was ready for it. Tommy stood and addressed the group, his deep voice silencing the chatter. "All right, everyone, if I could have your attention." His cheerful tone cut through the backyard noise like a bell. "First, I want to thank y'all for being here tonight. This is a special occasion, and we're here to celebrate Doug's promotion to shop foreman." The applause that followed was loud and enthusiastic, but Tommy raised his hands to settle everyone down. "Doug," he continued, turning to me with that signature grin of his, "how about you say a few words?" This was it, time to speak my truth. I stood, looking over the group of expectant faces. "Thanks, Tommy," I began. "And thank you all for being here. I know tonight was meant to be a celebration, and I guess, in a way, it still is." I turned my attention back to Tommy, my voice steady. "Sir, I can't thank you enough for offering me this opportunity. Your trust in me means a lot. But," I paused, letting the tension build, "I'm afraid I have to decline the position." A hush fell over the group, the cheerful atmosphere quickly replaced by confusion. "I hate to do this," I continued, "but as of today, I'm quitting." A few gasps escaped from the crowd. "I know this might mean I won't get a glowing reference, but that's fine. It doesn't matter, I'm leaving tomorrow, no matter what." Shock rippled through the group. Tommy opened his mouth to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. "This is my home," he began firmly, but I cut in. "Tommy, you've been more than fair to me, and I owe you an explanation." "But there are others here," I said, my tone growing colder, "who I don't owe a single thing to." Carol tried to interject, but I silenced her with a look. "Carol," I said sharply, "I think you and your little matchmaking club have done more than enough. I made it perfectly clear, crystal clear, that I wasn't interested in dating anyone. And I well made it clear that I didn't want to be anywhere near my ex-wife." I turned my gaze to Lisa, who had gone noticeably pale. "But apparently, what I want doesn't matter to anyone here." I let the words hang in the air, the weight of them sinking in. "So either I speak now, or I leave for good, your choice. Either one works just fine for me." The group fell silent. The only sound was Lisa's quiet sobbing. "All right, then," I said, my voice steady. "Let me tell you a story." Lisa looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears, silently begging me to stop. But I was far past the point of holding back. About 2 years ago, I left the only home I'd ever known. I walked away from a small town in Georgia, leaving behind a broken marriage and a family who chose betrayal over loyalty. 11 months ago, I came here, hoping for a fresh start. But apparently, my past refuses to let me go. And it seems to have some help. I shot a pointed glare at Carol, who quickly averted her eyes, her cheeks flushing with guilt. "I married my high school sweetheart 5 years ago," I continued, my voice calm but filled with tension. "She was everything I thought I wanted. After she graduated, we tied the knot, and for 3 years, I thought we had it all. Lisa worked at a beauty salon, and I spent my days working in one of my family's garages. My dad owned several across northern Georgia, and that's where I honed my skills as a mechanic. But just like Eden had its serpent, so did my marriage." I paused, taking a breath to steady myself as the crowd hung on my every word. I don't know what lies my good-for-nothing brother fed her to get her into bed, but whatever they were, they worked. Of course, neither of them had the decency to tell me the truth. Not a word. Then, 2 months later, I got the big news: "Honey, I'm pregnant." Like a fool, I was overjoyed. We'd been trying for a baby for the past year, and I thought my dreams were finally coming true. I looked around at the stunned faces, letting the weight of my next word settle. Imagine my surprise when, a few months later, during a routine checkup, the doctor told us there was a problem with the baby, a small heart defect. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to hear, but the real shock came when I learned it's common in babies born to mothers who use cocaine. Lisa sobbed harder, her hands covering her face, but I kept going. "I'll give her this much," she stuck to the script. Denial, excuses, and lies. But the facts were the facts. I filed for divorce the next day. I turned to Tommy, my voice softening slightly. And that's when my family showed their true colors. My wife, the one I thought I knew, and my parents started flooding me with apologies, excuses, and pleas for forgiveness. But I'd had enough. I left, hoping to start over somewhere new. And now, here I am, facing the same betrayal wrapped up in a different package. I couldn't stand to be in the same room as Lisa, let alone hear her voice. For weeks, I avoided her entirely. The sight of her made my stomach churn, and the sound of her excuses only fueled my anger. I was in shock. Everything I had dreamed of, our life together, the family we were supposed to build, was gone. The people who had promised to love me, to have my back, had lied and betrayed me. My parents, relentless as ever, pressured me constantly to talk to her. They wore me down, throwing around words like family and forgiveness until I finally gave in. When I did, I sat there and listened to Lisa's excuses, one after another. She cried, pleaded, and promised it was a one-time mistake. Eventually, I agreed to forgive her, but only under 2 conditions. The first: our preacher had to give a sermon on Sunday about the sin of coveting your brother's wife. The second: I'd stand in front of the congregation the following week to give my testimony, before I publicly forgave them both. I'll never forget the look on her face when I said that. I don't know if it was shame or fury, but whatever it was enough to send Ben running. He disappeared after that, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. But my parents? They didn't stop. Their arguments were exactly what I expected. "You need to be the bigger man, Doug. Lisa made a mistake, but her heart's in the right place." They just couldn't seem to grasp how deeply they'd hurt me. Finally, one day, I snapped. "Mention Ben's name to me one more time," I said in a low voice, "and I swear, I'll confront him. No matter the consequences. By the end of the week, you'll be burying your favorite son." The color drained from their faces, and they stopped pushing. They believed me, and honestly, I think I believed myself in that moment. I was done being the one who was expected to forgive, to forget, to move on as if none of it had happened. Over time, my anger became less fiery and more cold, a steady burn that wouldn't go away. I felt alone in ways I'd never known before. It was like someone had carved a part of me out, leaving a hollow space where my trust and love had once been. Sometimes, I'd catch myself looking to my side, as if Lisa were still there. I'd start to ask her opinion about something or reach for her hand out of habit. But, of course, it was never there. Every time it happened, the absence was like a punch to the gut, and the anger bubbled back to the surface. She had always been there for me, at least I'd thought so. I remembered my high school graduation. My dad couldn't make it because Ben had gotten into trouble again. Dad had dropped everything to help him, and Lisa had stepped in, cheering me on like I was the only person in the world who mattered. Those memories cut the deepest. My thoughts snapped back to the present when I noticed a couple of people starting to rise from their seats, as if they were about to leave. I cleared my throat, shooting them a hard look, and they quickly sat back down. Calmly, I reached to my side, picked up the Glock, and placed it on the table beside me. The sound of collective relief was almost audible. I hadn't even realized how tense everyone had been. I looked out at the group, their faces frozen in a mix of shock and discomfort, and continued. When Lisa tracked me down after the divorce, she didn't just try to talk. No, she moved into the same trailer park I was living in. Even after I filed for a restraining order and submitted a dozen complaints to the police, she didn't stop. I realized I couldn't stay there. I had to leave. So, when the divorce finally came through, I packed up whatever I had left and headed here to Texas. I didn't want to date, didn't want to talk about my past, and I sure didn't want to reconnect with my ex-wife. But apparently, I said, my voice hardening, what I want doesn't matter. Carol broke down into sobs. Doug, I'm so sorry. I didn't know, she said, her voice trembling. I turned to her sharply. Didn't know. I spat. Since when do you have to know someone's entire story to respect their privacy? Who the hell do you think you are that someone has to lay out their pain and history just to get the basic decency of being left alone? My words landed hard, and Carol looked away, tears streaking down her face. But I wasn't done yet. Before I could continue, Lisa's voice rang out, trembling and loud. Don't go. I can't live without you, Doug, she screamed, collapsing to her knees in a dramatic display of tears. You have to come home. You just have to. I turned slowly, locking eyes with her. My voice was cold, even, and firm. Listen to me, Lisa. I don't care what you decide to do with your life, but you stay away from me. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear from you. You can around with whoever you want, it doesn't involve me anymore. So stop pretending you can't live without me. I took a step closer, and she flinched as I leaned in just enough to make my next point clear. Next time you pull a stunt like this, I won't be so civil. And in case you forgot, I still have that restraining order. If I catch you violating it, I'll have every right to enforce it, and believe me, I will. Lisa crumpled, her sobs filling the air, but I had no sympathy left to give. The woman I'd once loved had turned into a shadow of herself, and no amount of her pleas could erase the damage she'd caused. Turning back to the stunned crowd, I glanced at Carol, who looked like she wanted to vanish into the ground, and then at Tommy, who was staring at me with wide, conflicted eyes. This isn't on you, Tommy, I said quietly. You've always treated me fairly. But this, I gestured toward Lisa and the group of wives, is why I'm leaving. I came here for a fresh start, and it's clear I'm not going to get that with people digging into my life and dragging up things I've spent years trying to escape. I picked up the Glock from the table and tucked it back into my waistband. The group flinched again, but I ignored it. The point had been made, and there was nothing more to say. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving behind the stunned silence of the people who'd finally realized just how far they'd pushed me. I had always believed in second chances, especially when it came to family. Doug, my ex-husband, was the kind of man who would give until he had nothing left. Most people saw him as quiet and shy, but to me, he was steady and strong, until he wasn't. When we were first married, we didn't have much. Doug worked long hours at one of his dad Tom's garages, while I was fresh out of beauty school. Together, we saved up enough to buy a little two-bedroom house. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Those first 2 years were tough. Money was tight, and we were just figuring out how to navigate life together, but we always had each other. And for a while, that was enough. Looking back, those early days felt like something out of a fairy tale. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it felt close. Sure, we argued like any couple, but it never lasted long. If things got heated, I'd pout or cry, and Doug would almost always give in. I tried not to use that to my advantage too often. I wanted to be fair. I loved him deeply, and I believed we were building something unshakable. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. Doug's younger brother, Ben, was always a wild card. Even when Doug and I were dating, I saw how much Ben's behavior tore him up. Ben had a knack for drawing attention to himself, and not in good ways. It wasn't long before he started hanging out with the wrong crowd. By the time Doug graduated high school, Ben was already in deep, hooked on pills and dragging the family down with him. He dropped out of school the same year Doug walked across the stage to get his diploma. Doug's parents, Tom and Paula, tried everything to help Ben, but nothing worked. Things got so bad that they eventually kicked him out after he stole money from them. It was one of the hardest decisions they ever made, but they felt like they had no other choice. When Ben came knocking on Doug's door a few months later, looking for a place to stay, it reopened every wound they tried so hard to close. I wanted Doug to let Ben stay with us. It was almost Christmas, and I couldn't stand the thought of him living on the streets during the holidays. You don't turn your back on family, I told Doug. I thought maybe if we gave Ben some stability, he'd find his way back to being the brother Doug used to know. But Doug was hesitant. He knew how much damage Ben had already caused, and he didn't want to risk our home becoming his next victim. Tom and Paula tried to sway Doug too, though I knew it came more from guilt than anything else. They couldn't take Ben back after everything he'd done to them, but they couldn't bear the thought of him out in the cold either. Just until after the holidays, Paula said. He just needs a little time. Reluctantly, Doug agreed. For a few days, it seemed like it might work. Ben kept to himself, mostly hanging out in the guest room. But it didn't last. Just after Christmas, I came home one evening to find Ben sprawled out on the floor of the living room, a bong beside him. The smell in the air was unmistakable. I'd smoked weed a few times in the past, so I knew exactly what it was. But this wasn't casual experimentation. This was a lifestyle. As I stood there, taking in the scene, I felt a rush, not just from the lingering smoke but from the realization that everything Doug had worried about was starting to unfold right in front of us. Ben wasn't just looking for a roof over his head. He was bringing his chaos with him, and it was only a matter of time before it spread. I grabbed a fan, opened a window, and set it up to blow the smoke out of the room. The acrid smell lingered, but I was determined to clear the air before Doug got home. Ben just sat there, slouched on the floor, mumbling to himself as if he wasn't even aware of the trouble he was causing. When I finished, I sighed and sat down beside him. Even though the details of that night are hazy, I still remember the way it all started. Ben, I said quietly, trying to keep my frustration in check. If Doug smells this when he gets home, he's going to kick you out. Maybe that's what I need, Ben muttered, his voice low and unsteady. I glanced over at him, taken aback by the sadness in his tone. Why do you say that? I asked, softening my voice. He turned to look at me, his eyes glassy and filled with tears. Doug's lucky, he mumbled. Doug's not lucky, I said firmly. He just works hard for what he has. That's not what I meant, Ben replied, his voice breaking slightly. Then what do you mean? I pressed, genuinely curious. He hesitated before whispering, I'm talking about you. The words caught me off guard. I felt my cheeks flush, and I turned my head, hoping he wouldn't notice. Doug's lucky because of you, Ben continued, his voice trembling. You give him the strength to do what he needs to do. Without you, he'd be just as messed up as I am. So yeah, he's lucky. If I'd found someone like you, maybe my life would have turned out different. I froze, unsure of how to respond. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to confront. Ben leaned closer, and whether it was the haze of the moment, the raw vulnerability in his voice, or something else entirely, I didn't push him away. I didn't fight back. I just sat there, confused and unsure of what to do. What happened next wasn't love. It wasn't tender or heartfelt, it wasn't anything like what I had with Doug. My husband knew me, loved me, and saw a side of me that no one else ever could. This was something entirely different. Something hollow. Afterward, I lay beside Ben, both of us catching our breath. He whispered, "Thank you." "Oh, God, thank you." I didn't respond. I stared at the ceiling, my heart heavy with guilt and confusion. I told myself I'd given him hope, that I'd done something good for him. And in that brief, misguided moment, it felt true. But deep down, I knew better. I stood up, shaky and full of regret. As I walked out of the room, I made a promise to myself that I'd never be so foolish again. In the weeks that followed, Ben avoided being alone with me. He moved out 3 weeks later, and I thought I could finally start putting the whole ordeal behind me. 2 weeks after that, I found out I was pregnant. Doug was overjoyed, and so was I. I had no doubt that the baby was his. After all, Doug and I had shared an intimate life together, full of moments that made this pregnancy feel like a blessing. It wasn't until Ben approached me, his voice cautious and trembling, that my certainty began to waver. "Do you think it could be mine?" he asked. I was stunned. Furious. Humiliated. Worst of all, I was horrified to learn that Ben had already told Tom and Paula about what had happened. They weren't happy, and their disapproval only made the situation worse. Before I knew it, Doug wasn't speaking to me, and I ended up living with his parents while he worked through his emotions, or ignored them entirely. When Doug finally spoke to me 2 weeks later, it was only because his parents had pressured him into hearing me out. But the conversation wasn't really a conversation at all. I begged him to listen, to believe how sorry I was and how much I still loved him. But his silence was deafening, and I knew that no matter what I said, I couldn't undo the damage I'd caused. I needed Doug more than ever. I begged him to listen, pleaded with him to give us a chance, cried until I had nothing left. But every time, he shut me down. His words were cold and unchanging. "You slept with my brother and had his child." For a week, I tried everything I could think of to break through the wall he'd built between us. His parents joined in, encouraging him to talk to me, and even Ben sent him a letter apologizing for everything. But I could see it, Doug's anger wasn't going away. If anything, it was growing, festering just beneath the surface. The more we tried to reach him, the further he retreated. Finally, I realized I needed to take a different approach. I moved out of his parents' house and focused on rebuilding my life. I found a new job at a salon and began meeting people in town. Slowly, I started sharing my story with a few women, leaving out the messiest details but making it clear how much I still loved Doug and wanted to make things right. One of those women was Martha. She had a kind heart and, after hearing my side, decided to help me. "He just needs to see how much you still care," she told me one day. She came up with the idea to get us talking at a party she was hosting. I thought it was my chance to fix everything. But the night of the party, things went terribly wrong. Doug didn't hold back. He told everyone there a blunt, condensed version of what had happened. The shame was overwhelming, but I pushed through it. I stood in front of everyone, begging Doug to come home with me. But when he finally spoke, his words were ice cold. "I'm done. Stop pretending this can ever be fixed." It felt like the final nail in the coffin. Doug. I knew Lisa still cared about me. Maybe a part of me still cared about her too, but I couldn't let that matter. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible. She'd slept with my brother, had his child, and lied to me about it for months. Every hope I had for the future was wrapped up in her. She was my soulmate, or so I thought. But now all I had left was anger. I didn't know what to do with it, so I buried myself in work, throwing every ounce of my energy into anything that would keep me from thinking about her. I avoided my family, my friends, and anything that reminded me of the life I'd lost. It wasn't long before my parents started trying to repair the damage, pushing me to let Ben back into my life. They told me he'd been clean for months and was trying to turn his life around. They even hinted that I should forgive Lisa. Forgive her? I asked, incredulous. She didn't just betray me, she tore my life apart. How do you forgive that? Their efforts only fueled my anger. I wasn't interested in forgiving, and I definitely wasn't interested in moving on. The only thing I wanted was to face Ben and force him to see the destruction he'd caused. When I finally arrived at my brother's apartment, I had no plan, just anger. Lisa's betrayal had destroyed everything, but Ben was the one who started it all. The lies, the selfishness, the chaos, it all led back to him. For years, I had been the one to clean up his messes, to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Not anymore. I stood outside his door, my heart pounding, and knocked. For the first time, it wasn't about making amends or finding closure. This was about letting him know exactly what he'd done and how deeply he'd torn our family apart. I kept a low profile, staying at a cheap motel about 5 miles outside of town. I couldn't stand being around anyone I knew. The walls of that tiny room felt like they were closing in on me, but it was still better than facing the people who reminded me of everything I'd lost. One night, I decided to head into town and grab a drink at a bar I used to frequent. I wasn't looking for trouble, just something to dull the ache in my chest. The place was crowded and noisy, filled with the kind of people who didn't ask questions. I thought I could blend in and keep my head down. But then, over the din of laughter and clinking glasses, I heard it. "You really pulled it off, Ben," a voice said, loud enough to cut through the crowd. "Seducing Doug's wife just to get back at him. I didn't think you had it in you. Guess that's what happens when you grow up in the shadow of the perfect son, huh?" The words hit me like a freight train. My chest tightened, and the room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the bar, struggling to breathe as the realization sank in. Ben hadn't just been reckless. He'd done it on purpose. He'd slept with Lisa not out of weakness or desperation but out of some twisted sense of revenge. It wasn't enough for him to ruin his own life. He wanted to ruin mine too. Before I knew what I was doing, I stormed out of the bar, my vision blurred with rage. I couldn't stay there a second longer. I needed air, space, anything to keep from exploding. As I paced outside, trying to calm myself down, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Doug?" I turned sharply to see Ben standing there, fumbling with his keys. He looked surprised, maybe even a little nervous, as if he knew he'd been caught. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound casual. For a moment, I didn't answer. I just stared at him, the weight of everything I'd learned pressing down on me. Then, without thinking, I closed the distance between us. "You think this is funny?" I said, my voice low and dangerous. Ben took a step back, his face paling. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my anger boiling over. "I heard them, Ben. I heard what you did, and why." His eyes widened, and he started stammering, but I didn't let him finish. You wanted to hurt me. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? You couldn't stand being in my shadow, so you decided to destroy everything I cared about. Doug, wait. No. I snapped, cutting him off. You don't get to explain this away. You don't get to make excuses. You didn't just betray me, you tore apart my entire life. And for what? Some petty, jealous revenge? Ben's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. I could see the fear in his eyes, and for a moment, I thought about walking away. But the anger inside me wouldn't let go. You don't deserve to just walk away from this, I said, my voice steady but cold. Not after what you've done. Ben took another step back, his hands raised defensively. Doug, I'm sorry, okay? I screwed up. Save it, I interrupted. You're not sorry. You're just afraid of what happens next. I stared at him for a long moment, my fists clenched at my sides. I wanted to hurt him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But as I looked at him, pathetic, small, and full of fear, I realized he wasn't worth it. You're not worth it, I said aloud, turning away. I walked back to my truck, the rage still simmering but no longer controlling me. As I drove away, I told myself I was done. Done with Ben. Done with Lisa. Done with everything that had dragged me down. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of something else, a quiet, fragile sense of peace. I didn't care to hear whatever excuses or pleas Ben had to offer. Betrayal like his cuts too deep. My own brother had slept with my wife and shattered my life in ways I never thought possible. As he stared at me, his throat dry, desperation and fear flickering across his face, I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy. Not anymore. I turned and walked back toward my truck, parked just a few yards away. The sound of my boots crunching against the gravel seemed to echo in the silence between us. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment. Looking back over my shoulder, I caught one last glimpse of him. Choices have consequences, Ben. This is yours. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled onto the road. In the rearview mirror, I watched as Ben's figure grew smaller and smaller, shrinking until it finally disappeared into the hazy distance. As the miles stretched between us, a swirl of emotions churned inside me, anger, sadness, exhaustion. But beneath it all, there was a quiet sense of finality. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Life didn't magically fix itself after that confrontation. My parents were furious when they learned I had cut ties with Ben for good. My mom threw every guilt-laden, biblical curse she could think of my way, and my dad just stared at me, his disappointment written all over his face. But I didn't care. I couldn't care. I had spent too long sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of people who had no problem betraying me. I wasn't about to let their guilt drag me back into a situation I'd fought so hard to escape. A few months later, I met Sarah. She came into the garage where I was working, a single mom driving an old car that was barely holding together. While I worked on her vehicle, we struck up a conversation, just small talk about the town, her kid, life. There was something about her, though. A quiet strength that drew me in. I wasn't looking for anyone. After everything that had happened, I didn't think I was capable of letting someone in again. But Sarah had this way of making complicated things feel simple. She never pried into my past, never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. We started seeing more of each other after that. Slowly, cautiously, I let her into my life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I began to see a flicker of hope. Maybe my past didn't have to define me. Maybe there was still something good waiting for me on the other side of all this pain.